The rain in Normandy didn't just fall, it felt like a deliberate weight, a cold, wet blanket that soaked through the wool of the M1941 field jackets and turned the French topsoil into a thick chocolatey sludge that swallowed boots and bogged down the heavy gears of war. In the gray, suffocating light of a June morning in 1944, Sergeant Elias "Hard Hand" Miller crouched in a crumbling stone doorway in a village that didn't matter to any mapmaker, but mattered to every man currently dying to take it. He was 28 years old, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh who had traded the searing heat of a furnace for a 10-pound hunk of walnut and Parkerized steel. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of handling molten metal, now gripped the checkered foregrip of his M1A1 Thompson submachine gun. He could hear the frantic, high-pitched, ripping cloth sound of a German MG-42 down the street, a terrifying 1,200 rounds per minute that turned the very air into a wall of lead. Beside him, the world was exploding in slow motion. Stone dust from the buildings choked his lungs, and the smell of cordite was so thick he could taste it on his tongue. Elias looked at the kid next to him, Private Benning. Benning was barely 19, his face still holding the soft lines of adolescence, now covered in a mask of terror and grime. His helmet rattled against his skull because his head was shaking so hard. Benning held his own Thompson like it was a live, venomous snake. Suddenly, a shadow flickered in a second-story window across the square. A German paratrooper, sharp and lethal, leaned out with an MP-40. Elias didn't think. He reacted. He swung the heavy barrel of the Thompson toward the window and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, a slow, rhythmic tat-tat-tat-tat. But as the .45 caliber rounds hammered out, the muzzle began to buck like a panicked horse. The first two bullets smashed into the stone sill, sending sparks flying. But by the fourth round, the heavy recoil had forced the barrel upward, pointing it at the roof. By the fifth, the slugs were screaming harmlessly into the empty gray sky. The German ducked back, unscathed and laughing, and Elias cursed under his breath, pulling his weapon back into the shadows. He had the stopping power to drop a charging bull, but he was fighting a beast that refused to stay level. If he couldn't learn to tame this machine in the next 30 seconds, neither he nor the kid would live to see the sunset. Have you ever stood face to face with a problem that was supposedly your greatest advantage, only to realize it might be the very thing that kills you? To understand why a veteran like Elias was struggling with a masterpiece of American engineering, we have to look back at the Chicago typewriter before it ever wore the olive drab of the U.S. Army. The Thompson submachine gun was the brainchild of General John T. Thompson, a man who envisioned a trench broom during the horrors of World War I, a weapon that could clear a path through the static misery of the Western Front. But by the time the Thompson was perfected and ready for mass production, the war to end all wars had already ended. General Thompson found himself with a revolutionary weapon and no war to sell it to. So, the Thompson found a different kind of employer in the 1920s and 30s. It became the ultimate status symbol for the American gangster, with its polished wood, cooling fins on the barrel, and the iconic 50-round drum magazine. It was a luxury item that cost $200, an astronomical sum when a brand new Ford car cost only $400. It was the weapon of Al Capone, John Dillinger, and Babyface Nelson. It was a tool of the outlaw elite, a weapon that roared through the streets of Chicago and New York during the Prohibition era. It was sleek, it was stylish, and it was deadly. By the time the world spiraled back into global conflict in 1941, the Thompson had been drafted into the military. But the military didn't want the luxury version. The Army demanded something rugged, something that could be mass-produced in the millions. The cooling fins were stripped away. The complex Blish-lock mechanism was simplified into a straight blowback system, and the heavy, unreliable drum magazines were replaced by sturdy 20 and 30-round sticks. It was now the M1A1, the Tommy gun of the American sergeant. It was heavy, nearly 11 pounds when fully loaded, and it carried a personality that was split between two worlds, the elegance of the jazz age and the brutal, muddy reality of the front lines. To a soldier like Elias, the Thompson was a badge of rank and a symbol of authority. Usually, only non-commissioned officers, paratroopers, and rangers carried them. It meant you were the one expected to lead the charge. The first one through the door, the man who brought the heavy rain. But there was a secret every veteran knew and every fresh recruit feared. The Thompson had a mind of its own. It was a weapon of raw, unbridled power, but it was also a weapon of immense physical demand. Does a weapon's reputation ever truly match the reality of holding it in your hands while someone is shooting back? The problem wasn't the build quality. The Thompson was built like a vault. The problem was physics, specifically the physics of the .45 ACP round. The Thompson fired the same massive bullet used in the Colt 1911 sidearm. It was a heavy, slow-moving slug designed for one thing: stopping power. When that bullet hit a man, he didn't just fall, he was physically stopped in his tracks. But when you put that caliber into a fully automatic weapon firing 600 to 700 rounds per minute, the laws of motion take a violent turn. This was the climb, because the Thompson stock was designed with a slight drop, and the weapon's center of gravity was shifted by the heavy bolt slamming back and forth. The recoil didn't just push back into the shooter's shoulder, it pushed up. For an inexperienced soldier, pulling the trigger on a Thompson was like trying to hold onto a pressurized fire hose that was determined to point at the sun. In the heat of combat, this technical quirk transformed from a nuisance into a tragedy. Green troops, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated terror, would spray and pray. They would see a German patrol emerging from the fog, freeze, and dump an entire magazine in one long, continuous scream of fire. Because they didn't know how to compensate for the climb, perhaps the first 2 bullets would hit the target, but the rest of the 30-round magazine would stitch a vertical line up into the trees. The Germans, armed with the MP-40, a weapon that was lighter, fired a smaller 9mm round, and had significantly less recoil, would simply wait for the American to run dry. While the American was frantically fumbling to change his magazine, the German would calmly step out and finish the job. The trench broom was becoming a liability for the men who didn't respect its physics. It was a veteran's weapon, yet the Army was increasingly composed of boys who had never fired anything more powerful than a bolt-action hunting rifle back in the Midwest. How many young men realized too late that their weapon was fighting them just as hard as the enemy was? If you looked at the official Army field manuals of 1943, you would find a very tidy, very clinical version of how to use the Thompson. The manuals spoke of short, controlled bursts of 2 to 3 rounds. They emphasized a proper upright shooting stance and measured breathing. The instructors back at Fort Benning taught the men to fire the Thompson from the shoulder, just like a rifle, aiming through the small peep sights. But the manuals were written by men who sat in air-conditioned offices in Washington or spent their days on clean, sunny shooting ranges in Georgia. They weren't written by men who were crouching in a foot of freezing mud, while mortar shells turned the world into a kaleidoscope of fire and dirt. In the reality of a chaotic ambush in the Ardennes or a frantic house-clearing mission in Sicily, short, controlled bursts felt like a death wish. When 3 Germans are rushing you with bayonets, your brain doesn't think about measured breathing. It thinks about survival. Commanders in the rear often ignored the complaints about the Thompson's accuracy. They saw the weapon as perfect on paper. It had the highest stopping power of any submachine gun in the war. It was reliable in the sand of North Africa and the snow of the Bulge. But they didn't see the skyscraping effect in the field. They didn't see the frustration of NCOs like Elias Miller, who watched their squads waste thousands of rounds of precious .45 ammunition on the clouds while the enemy closed in. There was a massive, lethal disconnect between the legendary reputation of the Tommy gun and its practical application in the hands of a terrified 19-year-old. The cost of this mechanical stubbornness was paid in the blood of American infantrymen who found themselves outgunned not by technology, but by a lack of understanding of their own tools. If the official doctrine was failing the men on the ground, who would be the one to rewrite the rules? Elias Miller knew he couldn't wait for a new manual. He had spent weeks watching his men fail. He had seen the look of utter confusion on a soldier's face when he aimed at a target 10 yards away and watched his bullet strike the chimney of a house 50 yards behind it. Elias was a man of the forge. He understood that metal and fire had to be forced into shape. You couldn't be polite with a Thompson. You had to bully it. During the rare quiet lulls in the fighting, while other men were catching sleep or writing letters home, Elias would take his Thompson out to a secluded ravine or an old abandoned orchard. He used empty cider barrels and wooden crates as his targets. He began to experiment, throwing away everything the instructors at Benning had told him. He realized that the upright, gentlemanly stance was the reason the gun was winning the fight. He developed a technique that he started calling the lean. Instead of standing straight, Elias would drop his center of gravity. He would crouch low, his left leg bent deeply forward, his body weight shifted almost entirely over his front foot. He would tuck the Thompson stock so tightly into his shoulder that it felt like it was part of his collarbone. But the real secret was in the leading. He started coaching his men with a simple, brutal command. Don't aim at his chest. If you aim at his chest, you're just giving him a haircut. Aim at his belt buckle. Aim at his damn knees. He taught them to physically pull the barrel down as they squeezed the trigger, fighting the upward surge with the raw strength of their left arm on the foregrip. It was an act of physical rebellion against the weapon's natural tendencies. He told them to imagine they were trying to shove a heavy oak door shut while a giant was trying to kick it open from the other side. He made them practice a rhythmic pull-down motion that synchronized with the slow, heavy tat-tat-tat cycle of the bolt. He was teaching them to ride the recoil rather than fear it. It was a messy, physically exhausting way to fight, and it left the men with bruised shoulders and aching backs. But it was the only way to make the Thompson do what it was told. Could a simple change in human posture really overcome the violent physics of a machine? The ultimate test of Elias's theory came in the claustrophobic outskirts of a town called Villers-Bocage. The hedgerows had given way to narrow, winding streets and ancient stone buildings. Elias's squad was tasked with clearing a series of fortified cellars that the Germans were using as a command post. The air was thick with the smell of burning diesel and masonry dust. The Germans were dug in deep, using the thick medieval stone walls to create deadly kill zones in the hallways. Elias led the way, his Thompson held low, his body already coiled in that aggressive forward-leaning stance. He signaled for a flashbang grenade to be tossed into a dimly lit basement. As the explosion rocked the floorboards, Elias burst through the door. In the corner, a German squad had survived the blast and was scrambling to their feet, their MP-40s swinging toward the doorway. This was the point of no return. In a space this small, a normal Thompson burst would have sent bullets ricocheting off the low ceiling, doing nothing but deafening Elias and leaving him vulnerable. But Elias didn't hesitate. He dropped into the lean, his boots finding purchase in the debris-strewn floor. As the first German opened fire, Elias squeezed his trigger and didn't let go. He didn't fire a short, controlled burst. He let the Thompson scream, but instead of the barrel rising, it stayed rock steady. He had aimed at the lead German's knees, and as the gun bucked, Elias used his steel mill strength to force the muzzle down. The heavy .45 slugs tore through the first two Germans like they were made of parchment, the sheer kinetic energy stopping their forward momentum instantly. The third German tried to dive behind a heavy wooden table, but Elias walked the fire across the room in a perfectly level, horizontal line. He didn't just clear the room, he dominated it. The Thompson wasn't a trench broom anymore. It was a surgical instrument of war. When the magazine clicked empty, the room fell into a haunting silence, broken only by the high-pitched ringing in Elias's ears and the metallic clink, clink, clink of hot brass casings settling on the stone floor. His squad rushed in behind him, eyes wide at the sight of the precision. He had mastered the beast, and in those few seconds of violence, he had saved every man in his unit. The status quo was gone. The Tommy gun had finally found its master. What happens to a soldier's confidence when he finally realizes he is more powerful than the weapon he carries? Word of Elias Miller's belt-buckle aim and the lean didn't stay in Villers-Bocage. It spread through the regiment like a wildfire. It wasn't an official part of the training, and you'd never find it in a manual. But in the foxholes, in the muddy ditches of the Siegfried Line, and behind the charred hulls of Sherman tanks, veterans were passing the knowledge down. You would see a veteran sergeant grab a greenie by the harness, shove him into a crouch, and yell over the sound of incoming artillery, "Lean into it, son! You gotta bully the lady, or she'll leave you for dead." The change was measurable. Squads that adopted the Elias method were becoming devastatingly effective in the brutal, house-to-house fighting of the European theater. The Germans, who had previously mocked the American sky shooters, began to truly fear the heavy, rhythmic thud of the .45. They realized that when an American sergeant with a Thompson entered a room, he wasn't just guessing anymore. He was hitting exactly what he aimed at. The Thompson began to change the very nature of American infantry tactics in the final year of the war. It became the ultimate room clearer, the weapon that allowed a small group of determined men to hold a crossroad or a bridgehead against superior numbers. Because of the secret dissemination of these field-expedient techniques, the Thompson's combat statistics shifted. Ammunition was used more efficiently, and casualty rates among NCOs began to drop. The Chicago typewriter was finally writing the final chapters of the Third Reich, one heavy, stabilized burst at a time. It was a grassroots revolution in marksmanship, born of necessity and passed from man to man in the dark of the night. Do the most important lessons in life ever really come from a textbook, or are they always forged in the fire of experience? As the war in Europe drew to a close, the Thompson began to see its sunset. It was a masterpiece, but it was an expensive one to produce. The Army began to favor the M3 grease gun, a weapon made of stamped sheet metal that looked like a kitchen appliance but was far cheaper and easier to handle. But for the men who had fought from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, the grease gun was a toy. The Thompson had a soul. Elias Miller survived the war. He returned to Pittsburgh with a Bronze Star, a slight limp from a piece of shrapnel in his thigh, and a permanent low-level ringing in his ears that he called his war song. He went back to the steel mills, back to the heat and the metal, but he was a different man. He never talked much about the medals or the glory, but on his mantle he kept a small, tarnished brass casing, the first .45 shell he had fired using the lean in that French basement. He was recognized by his peers at the local VFW, not just as a veteran, but as the man who tamed the Tommy. It was a title that carried a weight no general could bestow. To the men of his squad who made it home, Elias wasn't just a leader. He was the reason they had a home to go back to. He had taught them how to survive their own equipment. The Thompson's legacy is often wrapped in the Hollywood glamour of trench coats and violin cases, but its true story is etched in the strained muscles and bruised shoulders of the American infantrymen. It was a weapon of deep contradictions, luxury and mud, elegance and slaughter. The Thompson submachine gun remains the most iconic silhouette in the history of American arms. It stands as a powerful testament to an era where the human element was just as vital as the mechanical one. It serves as a reminder that no matter how advanced, how expensive, or how powerful a tool is, it is nothing without the will, the strength, and the ingenuity of the person wielding it. It took men like Elias Miller to look at a technical flaw, a violent, upward climb, and see not a failure, but a challenge to be conquered. They turned a gangster's plaything into a soldier's lifeline, turning the Chicago typewriter into a symphony of survival that helped liberate a continent. The next time you see that distinctive walnut stock or hear that slow, unmistakable tat-tat-tat in a documentary or a film, don't just see a gun. Remember the lean. Remember the weight of the steel and the immense physical effort it took to keep that barrel level while the world was falling apart. Their legacy isn't just in the history books, it's in the courage it takes to master the beast in our own lives.